Welcome back to Direct Station, where politics are in retrograde. I am Kate Carey. If you've been wondering why otherwise noble, uniformed American soldiers just got onto their knees and painstakingly rolled out a red carpet for a war criminal who has overseen the death of over 1 million of his own soldiers, or if you've been wondering how we got to a place where American diplomacy consists of real estate developers misunderstanding basic diplomatic practice, or if you've been wondering why Russia seems to be gaining in power when it should be shrinking and being brought to its knees for its crimes, or if you've been wondering why this all feels like watching empire expand when consciousness about it is rising in you and in those around you all day long, every day. Y'all, you know there's an explanation. So let's talk about it. For those just tuning in, hi. Thanks for coming. I'm so glad you decided to give the podcast a try. Here's how it works. You tolerate a little more astrology than you might in your day-to-day, and I provide a new way to look at what we're living through. Today, we're going to talk about Russia, this stunning humiliation of American power, but also about something much deeper, the astrological patterns that have accompanied every major shift in Russian borders for centuries, and why Ukraine's fight for sovereignty is actually an opportunity to consider our own dignity, our own sovereignty. It'll go like this. First, the news, briefly. I am, after all, not Peter Jennings. I'm just a quick capture using my own perspective. Next, the astrological phenomena we've got going on that plays a role in all of this. Next, the history of the situation and the humans and the planet, the patterns we can see if we look back. Some literary context from the seers and sayers who've come before us. And then finally, what do we do with it? How do we process it? How do we make meaning of it for ourselves and our own lives? Come on, let's go. Also, I should say on today's episode, I will very, very, very briefly discuss war crimes that might disrupt your nervous system in a way that is unhelpful if today is not your day to hear such things. It'll be less than 60 seconds when it happens, and I will warn you so you can fast forward if we still use that phrase. I've decided to do it, though, because we do need to understand the stakes of the situation without being overwhelmed by the details of it. I am myself a survivor of torture, so I don't take anything about your nervous system for granted. And I will always help you take care of yourself as you listen when these issues arise, as they do and will in a podcast about humans being human. So let's start with what actually happened first, because I'm not sure we all have some of the salient facts. The American media, I don't tend to make statements about capital T, capital M, the media, but I will say that I think it's fairly rare to hear a comprehensive analysis of what's going on over there. I'm not going to provide that today. I'm going to do it as much as I can to just provide kind of some of the basic facts that seem to be missing in the discourse. But I'll speak from a set of values. I'll be clear about what those values are as I go along. So if you have a different story in mind about what Russia is or has been and what its relationship to Ukraine might be, it might be that we are working with a different set of stories, a different set of values. And so I ask you to hear mine out. And if you like, I will hear yours. On August the 6th, Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, an outer borough real estate developer with 0.0 diplomatic experience prior to this 2.0 version of Trump's America. This guy went to Moscow for the 5th meeting with Putin. And Putin, that former KGB officer who knows exactly how to humiliate an adversary, gives Witkoff a gift to deliver. Putin likes gifts, likes to give gifts that are symbolic. And multiple layers are often embedded within those gifts. So last time, he gave the guy a painting of Trump for Trump that I assume was bugged. But in this oddly flattering painting of Trump on his like ear injury day, that somehow includes the Statue of Liberty behind him and a much larger American flag than I recall being there. Anyway, so Putin hands Witkoff this gift and asks him to pass it along. This time, it's the Order of Lenin, a Soviet-era medal for spies and traitors that has not been awarded since the fall of the Soviet Union. I think the last one was in 1991. Intended for a senior CIA official whose mentally ill son had died fighting for Russia against Ukraine in 2024. That's the award, for example, that Russia gave to Kim Philby when he betrayed his country, the United Kingdom, during the Cold War and caused great death and loss for the people he had sworn to and spent a lifetime pretending to protect. This is the award that Putin treated like a special present as he handed it to this ignorant, naive man who proudly brought it home to the boy's mother, who is, you cannot make this up, the deputy director of the CIA, who had expressed the hope that her son's tragic death would not be used for Russian propaganda. So that happened. But also on that day, Wyckoff was played in another way. The man somehow finds himself in a meeting alone with the former head, again, the notoriously deceptive, ruthless, effective secret police of the Soviet era, finds himself alone with the guy, Putin, and 3 people in the room, Wyckoff, Putin, and Putin's translator. Not an American translator who understands geopolitics and diplomatic tactics of the Kremlin or its leader, just a Russian translator dude whose number one job is to help his boss achieve what he wants to in the meeting. So long story short, Wyckoff leaves the meeting completely believing that he has been told that Putin was prepared to surrender land he had taken by force. I should say the way Russians take land by force is by sending enough untrained men by the hundreds day after day running into the oncoming fire long enough to consume the precious artillery Ukraine has. Like, you know that scene in Game of Thrones where Jon Snow and Tormund are at the White Harbor where the wildlings have a stronghold and the Night King shows up and all the wraiths just go pouring over the side of the mountain and become like a river of bodies attacking the village. So, but that's how I imagine these, what they call them meat assaults, right? So that's the idea. The strategy for Russia is and has been, we're just bigger than you. We have more bodies than you. We have more land mass and therefore more bodies. Not that much more money and not that much more armor, not that much more tech, but we've got bodies and we can just exhaust the enemy by sending them into battle to exhaust with quantity. And here and there it works at a rate of a few kilometers a day. So they've taken some significant swaths of land over the course of 2.5 years of this, while sending missiles into apartment buildings across the country every single night. So occupying a chunk of Ukraine, using those tactics. So Putin says, hey, dude, even though we don't hold all of these 7 oblasts that we want, you know, again, like picture the United States, the good chunk of the eastern seaboard, not quite to Ohio, but like, you know, a good chunk of that eastern seaboard. That, like, this is the part that he hasn't claimed all of it with military force, but he's claimed bits of like each state represented there. And so he's like, you know, I'd like to take that. I'd like to take those provinces. I'd like to take those oblasts, and you know, and then we can be cool. 2 of them, by the way, that he mentions in this meeting, Kherson and Zaporizhia, are 2 oblasts that have some of the most precious rare earth minerals in the world that are all super relevant now in what we're doing, and the largest nuclear power reactor in Europe. So Wyckoff somehow in this meeting thinks Putin is offering to withdraw Russian forces from these oblasts. He comes back and he tells Trump we made a deal. Russia will pull back. Trump, ever ready to believe in his own greatness, announces a grand summit. And when European leaders called to clarify, as one does, and become clear that Wyckoff has gotten it completely backwards, it's too late. The summit has been announced. The invitations, if you will, had been sent. And so like Rose hanging off the edge of the Titanic, believing that the only way to stop the wedding is to leap into the sea, Trump says, yeah, we just gotta go forward with it. So he does, with literally no goal. Absolutely zero understanding of the magnitude of what he was about to do and how it would unravel years of containment of one of the most dangerous, murderous dictators on the planet. So yeah, actual American soldiers in desert fatigues got onto their actual knees in Alaska to roll out an actual red carpet with F-22 fighter jets standing nearby as props of the might we wouldn't use in this scenario, as if to say, I don't know, show the visitor the toys. Like it was like a celebration, which is somehow worse than the capitulation we were all anticipating. So the summit ends, as anyone could have predicted, with no deal. But Trump, who looked exhausted and spoke for 2 minutes after his guest's 12 minutes remarks, I should say when two nations have a meeting and they're on one of the land of one of them, the norm is that the guy whose land we're on, you're in my country, we had a meeting, we're having now a press conference, I'm going to speak first and frame what's happened here. That's not what goes on. Putin speaks first. Putin speaks in Russian for 12 minutes. He says one thing in English. He turns to President Trump at some point and says, "You should come to Moscow." Trump says, "Oh yeah, no, I would like that." Trump speaks for 2 minutes. He says, like blah, blah, blah. They leave, but then afterwards, it starts to become clear that Trump is now realigned again with Russia as he was about, I don't know, 4 months ago. And he's saying that Ukraine would probably need to give up territory and we can't expect a ceasefire unless an agreement like that is signed. So who knows exactly what was said or leveraged? Which flatteries worked best? I'm assuming something about 2020 and how Trump was robbed, right? I think there was a disparagement by Putin of the mail-in ballots and how that's so dangerous. So now we're going to get rid of the mail-in ballots. I mean, or it might have been the offers he made. We now know that he made an offer of a real estate deal in Russia, or he offered some rare earth deals in the stolen Ukrainian territory were he to keep it. It might have been the threats that resonated. Putin once again rattled his nuclear saber in this conversation, we have now learned. Something worked. The dynamic shifted. Trump went into the meeting saying on the plane to a reporter, I'll know in 2 minutes if I'm going to get a ceasefire. If I'm not, I'm going to walk out. Well, he didn't walk out. He stayed, and he came out surrendered. He came out capitulated. He came out in concert with Putin and allowed Putin to speak. The only way to make sense of this orientation to the question of how do we solve a war that is only about an all-out, unprovoked invasion of one country into another is to, A, assume we now live in a world where whoever has the most guns or the most greed or the most ambition gets to roll into any place they wanna and take land, hurt people, upend lives, crops, country, and any sovereign border anywhere. Or B, assume that the imperial mythology that Putin has resurrected and embellished and asserted in order to make Russia an empire again is real and relevant. So we are talking today about the delusion, the lie, the dream, even, that Ukraine isn't a real country, that Ukrainian isn't a real identity, that the Ukraine, as the Soviets called it, is just a fertile landmass that naturally belongs to Russia. And the conflict rooted in that mythology is coming to a head at this exact moment that you might expect if you've been watching Russian borders and the sky above them for a century or two. Okay, so what's happening in the sky that explains all this? This moment of imperial mythology, meaning humiliating outcomes, as these two Napoleonic figures come together on the edge of their two countries. We're in the grip of an extraordinary cosmic pattern. If you've listened at all, you know I've got to bring up Saturn and Neptune, but there's another guy in play here as those two get ever closer to a perfect conjunction next year. So Saturn being reality and consequences, the harsh truth that can't be avoided. Neptune being dreams, delusions, the fog of fantasy. These two, along with the two jabronis in bad suits, have been dancing closer and closer and creating this background weather of empires dissolving, empires changing, empires rattling, right? Borders blurring, truth and lies becoming indistinguishable. So that's what's been happening all over the globe. Anywhere you look, you see empires overreaching. You see empires at play. You see challenges. You see people rising. You see movement. You see lies. There is action, right? The whole thing is kind of like bubbling now. But why now? Why did we escalate the dance in a way that includes a US military base, a show of fighter jet strength, or even persuasive reminders of the forever option of nuclear war? On August 8th, right when all this diplomatic disaster is unfolding, right when Witkoff's incompetence is becoming clear, and Trump is committing to this humiliating summit, Mars, the god of war, the planet of aggression, of combat, of action, of doing, of causing, of military expression, is an exact opposition to this Saturn-Neptune conjunction. I mean, it's so much. So oppositions create tension. They create decision points between two forces, often leading to frustration or a conflict between these two archetypal forces with any planetary body. So Mr. War, in a hard aspect to this, 180 degrees, exactly across the circle of the zodiac from Mr. Borders and Mr. Lies, in a tense, decision-inducing posture. Y'all, come on. You cannot make it up. So let me explain why this is huge. Mars is the warrior, the aggressor, the planet of action and conflict. When Mars opposes something, it's like striking a match near gasoline. It activates everything. It brings hidden differences to the surface, forcing confrontation. And Mars is not opposing just any planet. It's opposing both Saturn and Neptune simultaneously. So think about that. Saturn-Neptune in this slow, steady build towards reality, where this collision between reality and delusion, harsh truth and comfortable lies coming together. They've been creating this foggy, confused, what's even real anymore energy. And I should say, they are both in retrograde, right? So they left the like gooey, spacious, dreamy, can't see truth from lies, can't understand things, land of Pisces. Neptune rules the land of Pisces, right? So they're in this like dreamland, disillusion land, delusion land, Delulu land of Pisces with the Neptune, the Delulu planet, right? Moving real slow the last couple decades. So all kinds of disillusion, all kinds of disinformation, all kinds of collective confusion, all kinds of collective delusion, all kinds of a whole bunch of people think something that isn't true is true. That's Pisces Skyland. And so both of these guys, Saturn and Neptune, spend a long time, decades, in that Pisces Skyline. And recently they crossed into Aries, which is about action, which is about decision, which is about doing, causing, aggression. So no longer have they been sitting in there. They've been in Aries for a minute. They moved houses, they moved locations, but they left a bunch of their stuff behind, right? So they've got to go back into that Pisces Skyland for a minute. They'll be back in Aries by February of 26. But first they have some unfinished business back there. I don't know what it is, but they are moving backwards, and retrograde means reconsidering, reimagining, re-examining, revisiting, right? So there's stuff we haven't yet resolved about those collective dreams. So they're heading back into that Skyland to pick up their last boxes that they left when they moved. You know, those boxes of bits. I always label the last box in the house bits, because it's just like all this like debris that like of life that you leave behind. That's what's back there. So he's got to go. Both of them have to go back into that Pisces Skyland for a minute, come back out, meet at 0 degrees of Aries, which is a very, 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 very potent point of action, of aggression, of doing, of changing. So while they're in retrograde, while they're reconsidering all this, while they're going back to gooey Pisces, this whole thing is getting weirder, right? So while they're in that retrograde motion, heading back to Pisces, they're not there yet. Mars shows up. Mars comes along from the opposite side of the sky, and he's like, guys, get aggressive about it though now. Right? Mars is ruled by Aries, by the way. So like there's a lot going on with these themes. This is why everything, I should say Mars rules Aries. Mars is not ruled by Aries. This is why everything exploded last week. This is why Putin chose that exact moment for his humiliating power play with the Order of Lenin. This is why Witkoff's misunderstanding could not be quietly corrected behind closed doors, but instead became this public diplomatic crisis. Mars opposing Saturn-Neptune does not allow for subtle corrections or quiet adjustments. It demands public, often war or conflict adjacent confrontation between truth and lies. And here's what's even more fascinating. Throughout history, every time Mars has activated a Saturn-Neptune conjunction through opposition or square or conjunction, we see military conflicts in Russia turn in decisive ways that are really about competing versions of reality. This whole dream and lies thing is repetitive in Russia. lots of places on the planet. Okay, so let's look at a little bit of that pattern. So when Mars joined the 1917 Saturn-Neptune conjunction during the Russian Revolution, right? You've got Tsar Nicholas and his family. I'm sure you've seen or imagined this scenario where these people are imprisoned in a fancy house out in the countryside. They are ultimately murdered, and this provisional government takes over. So we're doing away with this feudal system where you've got the czar, the liege lords, and the feudal system underneath it that is oppressive, right? So there is a revolution that rises up and says, no more, we are not going on with this way of being. And so then you've got this provisional government taking hold, and they're in the process of setting up this democratic republic. But in comes the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, leading what's called the October Revolution, right? So February to October, it's a little dicey. October, Mars hits the conjunction. Mars joins the conjunction. And suddenly, Lenin and his friends are seizing power from that provisional government and establishing the first socialist state in history, right? So not just a change in government, but a complete reimagining of what Russia even means. When Mars opposed the conjunction of Neptune and Saturn in 1952 and 1953, Putin is born under this one. Stalin dies under this one. And there's this power struggle about the future of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev opens some historical archives, allowing some truth about Stalin's crimes to be revealed. Releases some political prisoners caught up in the purges of locked in the gulags. He loosens censorship a little bit. He allows a little freedom in the arts and in culture, right? So again, a reimagining of what Russian could be about, right? And it comes through the death of their very own god of war. When Mars squared the 1989 conjunction, the Berlin Wall falls, and there's this crumbling of the Soviet Empire and a return to far more humble borders for the nation of Russia itself. So no longer did it control the Eastern Bloc, it just controlled itself. It did not control Ukraine. So by 91, there's this vote, as there was in so many countries and regions, of what had been the Soviet Union. Folks are asking themselves, would you like to be free and start over, or would you like to be a part of Russia? People of Ukraine said, like many countries, no, we'd like to go ahead and be our own country. So they established their own nation. Not the first time, by the way, but the strong time. So this August 8th Mars opposition that we're talking about, that's triggering, it's not just triggering any Saturn-Neptune conjunction. It is triggering a Saturn-Neptune conjunction that is part of this great pyramid configuration we've been talking about, where Uranus, Mr. Chaos, and Pluto, Mr. Transformation, are also deeply involved. So Mars is literally lighting the fuse on the most powerful astrological configuration in human history. And our little story with Russia took a significant turn, as it always does when Mars shows up to these conjunctions. So what do we get? We got a fake diplomatic breakthrough based on complete misunderstanding. A war criminal being welcomed with red carpets and fighter jet displays. An American president suggesting that invasions should be rewarded with territory. Mars says, let's fight. But America didn't even understand what the fight was about. Honestly, we are just enablers in this old and long Russian tale. We were the gatekeepers. We were the jailkeeper on the Monopoly game board. Trump just said, no, yeah, all right, you can pass go. It's all right. It's peak Saturn-Neptune with Mars activation, aggressive confusion, militant delusion, warfare based on fundamental misunderstandings about reality itself, a reimagining of what the world can look like. Putin knew exactly what he was doing. Trump and Witkoff didn't even know what game they were playing. The cosmic timing is breathtaking. Mars lit the match on August 8th, and by August 15th, we have the Alaska Summit, the full manifestation of what happens when Martial energy activates a Saturn-Neptune conjunction without consciousness. These things can all happen at higher and lower frequencies. This is one that happened on a low frequency with zero consciousness. Instead of clarity, we get deeper confusion. Remember these retrogrades. The planets are going backwards in Aries now. These two big, powerful planets, reality and delusion, they're going backwards. So, like, it's getting gooier, it's getting murkier. So instead of standing up to empire, we legitimize empire. Instead of Mars bringing the courage to face hard truths, it brings humiliation of not even understanding what was true. Throughout history, every major Saturn-Neptune conjunction has coincided not just with shifts in Russian ideology or the conversation about what Russia could be, it's brought about these changes in the Russian borders and challenges to the imperial ambitions of Russia itself. In 1846, we've got a Saturn-Neptune conjunction, and the border between Norway is reviewed, cleared, fortified. 1917, during that Bolshevik Revolution we were talking about, you have a shrinking of Russia, right? So like all these states that had been consumed by the Russian Empire at that point are watching this mess unfold with, the Tsar is down, there's factions fighting about who's going to end up running the country. So while that happens, Finland, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all say, actually, I'd like to declare independence. We'd like to take our own country back, right? 1952 and 1953, Stalin dies and politics shift, but there's a restricted zone established on the western border and conversations that result in parts of Turkey being granted back to Turkey, Crimea being granted back to Ukraine. In the end, the indigenous populations, including the Tatars that have been deported and sent to Siberia, were even allowed to return to Ukraine. 1989, we know what went down there. We know that the Soviet Union dramatically shifted and the borders moved fast, right? Back to this original smaller nation state. So every single time Saturn and Neptune dance, Russian borders, Russian power shifts, and the question of sovereignty, who gets to exist, who gets to be free, comes to the forefront. But this time it's different because Saturn and Neptune are not just meeting anywhere. They are meeting as part of what astrologers call the Great Pyramid, this unprecedented configuration that includes Pluto and Aquarius, meaning transformation of power structures, and Uranus and Gemini, meaning revolution in communication and thought. I should say that I have been calling this once and ever configuration a Great Pyramid, but yesterday I heard Austin Coppock, and he's this great astrologer, scholar, teacher, seer. He called it the Great Flying Wedge of Chaos. I've heard him use that expression before, but it wasn't until we started to really live it that I now like heard it again and was like, oh wow, yeah, no, that is how it feels. I think I like it better. So y'all, this isn't just another cycle of Russian expansion and contraction. This is bigger than that. I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, there are conversations happening right now where certainly Zelensky and the Ukrainian people could decide that they would like their own borders to shrink. They would like to give some of their country to Russia in exchange for peace. I don't know that that's what's going to happen. It doesn't seem like that is what they would want to do, but that might occur here. If it did, I would still think it's like temporary. I don't know. It still seems like this thing is building. Like that we're not at the thing yet. We're not at the moment yet. But empire, to be sure, all over the globe is going to be reshuffled when this climax happens. It's just what happens when this perfection occurs next year. And so what I notice is that all of the empires all over the globe are A, overreaching, and B, there is a rumbling about, what are you doing? Like, why are you living that way? Why are we living this way? Why are we acting this way? Like yesterday, there's a massive, I was going to say riot because, well, there's this massive protest, the biggest protest since the war began in Israel of the Israeli citizenry. And the Israeli government called it Hamas rioters. Right. So there's just things going on in all of these empires with all of these wars and all of this human suffering, all of this ghastly human suffering that is intolerable. Like it cannot go on. Right. Like you watch it and there's just no way that it can carry on very much longer. We know this. We feel this. We know it is rising, and things that rise, everything that rises must converge, right? Like this, these things will come to a head. I know this. You know this. Putin knows this. That's why he's so desperate. That's why he's throwing millions of his own people into a meat grinder for a few meters of Ukrainian soil every day. 50 meters a day on average, slower than World War I trench warfare. At this rate, if nothing changes and Kyiv just eventually falls, it would take 5 years. And I'm telling you right now, this situation is not going to last for 5 years. But to understand why Ukraine matters, why this isn't just about land, but about the very concept of human dignity and freedom, we need to understand what Ukraine actually is. Not the Russian imperial mythology, but the real nation that has fought for centuries to exist as its own independent state. I mean, I'm going to very briefly address that mythology by telling you a few stories about it. But the reason I'm going to go into it is because I need you to understand that what is happening here is the assertion of a narrative that is made up. Very, 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 very small number of people in the world think it's real. The rest of the world knows that it's not. But the mass delusion, the sort of tempting delusion of the lie of the mythology is sort of part of the point of what's happening here with Neptune. And that lie is just further and further in play as Neptune and Saturn move backwards. And that question of what is true, what is real, gets questioned, gets opened. So this all starts with this medieval state called Kievan Rus, some between the 8th and 13th centuries, located in and around modern-day Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. Moscow did not exist yet. So modern-day Ukraine is the center of Eastern European civilization at the time. Moscow is tribal land with very far to the east, by the way, very far to the east, without links to external economies. There's no trade coming in and out of there. They're just kind of in this like isolated tribal life over there. The name Rus, of that Kievan Rus name, comes via a group of Scandinavian Vikings who had wandered east once their presence had been established in Europe and in the Middle East. So modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia can all claim their origins in that civilization. But it is Putin and Putin alone who states that Ukrainians are subjects of Russia, therefore, as a result of that common history. It's like if 3 of us all lived in a tiny 1-bedroom apartment in New York City at one point in our youth, and 40 years later, living our own lives in other places, I say, because we all lived there in that one spot, I now control you and your life, right? It's an absurd thing to assert. So also the territory has been controlled by so many different groups of people. You've got the Mongols. By the way, if you don't know that history, if you don't know about it and you're curious, there's an amazing little TV show called, it's not Genghis Khan because it wouldn't be named after the man of color. It's named after the white man whose name is Marco Polo. It's a Netflix show. It's really good. Anyway, it portrays the Mongols taking over these lands. So you've got the Mongols there, you've got the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth there, you've got the Australian-Hungarian Empire there at one point, you've got the Ottoman Empire there. In the 20th century, you've got Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia there. All right, so Russia being like, actually, guys, ignore that Polish history, ignore that Greek history, ignore all the associations this place with the rivers and the minerals and the breadbasket farming capacity. It's actually pretty Russian, right? Because there's this one moment, see, where the Viking leader of Kievan Rus, Saint Vladimir, got a lot of Vladimirs in the story, who also governed a city in what would become eventually Russia. Again, Russia did not exist yet, but he's got this little township that he's also governing in addition to running Kievan Rus. And that little township over there is within what is now today Russia. So this guy, Vladimir, Viking, as Vikings did occasionally convert to Christianity. The local Christianity in Kievan Rus is Orthodox Christianity. So Vladimir converts to Christianity, and in so doing, according to Putin. According to Putin, in that seminal act, Vladimir unites these people who would hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years live quite separately and far away from each other. There's a border between them, of course, but because of that conversion moment in 988, Putin's quote, I'll quote him, and he says, that moment, quote, continues to affirm our affinity today. He's got this essay he writes with all this made up history in it and all these made up conclusions in it. So there are moments over and over and over again throughout Ukrainian history in which the Ukrainians decide for themselves an identity, a nation, a state, a land that's their own and separate from all their neighbors. And who can blame them? I'm not sure if you're aware of the Holodomor in the 1930s, which predates the Nazi Holocaust and even World War II. The Holodomor is a state-sponsored famine in which Stalin's regime systematically takes at gunpoint all of the food grown in Ukraine, locked Ukrainians out of cities where the food was kept. And over the course of 3 years, 1930 to 1933, 4 million people starved to death, very visibly, very publicly. So if we look at the humans and the astrology of one of those moments where Ukraine asserts itself, that is actually the astrology of this moment I'm about to explain to you is super relevant to today's astrology. We have the Maidan, which is the revolution of dignity, also sometimes called the Orange Revolution, although you don't hear that you don't hear that expression so much anymore. But so the revolution of dignity, the Maidan revolution, you might remember it's November 2013. So 2013 is a year when a lot of youth are rising up. You've got Egypt, you've got Brazil, you've got Turkey. This happens in Ukraine as well. So in 2013, the Ukrainian parliament approves the signing of an agreement with the EU. And they say, yeah, the president, you can move forward and with this step that we've all talked about so much. It's this step that countries take when they're asserting an interest in and are being welcomed into the process to try to join the EU. It's a big deal. It's a big deal for young people in Ukraine whose entire lives, work, career, civil society, opportunity, free travel would just explode under this agreement. Like imagine any 20-year-old or 21 or 22-year-old that you have in your life, somebody who has graduated from college and is sort of trying to figure out what they're going to do with their lives, how they're going to build their lives, how they're going to build their career, what meaning they'll make in the world. If you know somebody in that position, some youth in that position, you also know that, can you imagine if they suddenly tomorrow had access to an EU passport with their name on it? Like what could be different for them? What they would have access to that they don't have access to now here with our country doing what it's doing, right? So like suddenly they would have other opportunities for education, other opportunities for work, other opportunities for community, for travel, for learning, for seeing, for being out in the world, right? People want that for their kids and the kids want that for themselves. But at the very last minute, the president, so the legislature says, yeah, go ahead and sign it. Very last minute, after months and months and months of discussion, their president, this dude, decides to capitulate, much like our own president, to Putin. Putin had been pressuring him. And in the end, this guy refuses to sign the agreement. Well, the streets exploded. Two of the players in our Flying Wedge of Chaos were playing a big role. Pluto, Mr. Transformation, and Uranus, Mr. Chaos, are in a 90-degree square. That's a square of conflict, square of tension, square of like, I'm provoking you, you're provoking me. What is going to happen here? Transformation, chaos. So the planets, they're like, metaphorically are whispering to the young rebels all over the globe, change shit, go. So young Ukrainian students gather peacefully in Kiev's central square, which is called the Maidan. And these special forces sent by the president show up in the middle of the peaceful protest, armed to the teeth. Does that sound familiar? And they brutally beat these kids. Bloody, horrific violence against kids whose only crime was wanting to be European rather than Russian. But then something extraordinary happened. And I want you to remember this moment, this point, this turning point. A horrible thing occurs, an outrageous, horrible thing occurs. And the next response is the thing that starts to change everything. right? So when we are watching these horrible things unfold, I'm not saying this so that you just kind of tolerate the horrible things. I'm saying allow yourself to be moved by them, because what is unfolding here is a series of events, just like what happened in Maidan when Pluto and Uranus were squared. So a horrible thing happens. The next day, December 1st, the parents and the grandparents of these kids flood the square. They say, "You don't beat our children." It became this mantra, "You don't beat our children." And for 93 days through the bitter Ukrainian winter, ordinary people of all kinds, and this is where I'm saying, like, the reds, the blues in America right now, like all people across all these lines of difference came together. So many different groups and subgroups occupy that square. So they build a city within a city. They create their own government, I swear to God, and their own systems of care. They own they set up their own resource acquisition and their own distribution systems. It's stunning. It's beautiful. It's inspiring. When the regime cleared them in February of 2014, another horrible thing that caused what happens next, right? So the horrible thing in February 2014 is that 100 protesters over the course of a few days are killed because they are shot from snipers shoot them from the roofs. That's part of the crackdown. That's part of how the government decides to clear the square. You can see videos of this online. It's horrific. People just dropping in the street because of the snipers. Today, those individuals are called the Heavenly 100. They're martyrs for freedom. And the resistance rises up higher, bigger, louder, more intense, more robust, more. We have reached a turning point. And in the end, Yanukovych flees to Russia like the coward that he was, home to daddy. So this was not the CIA manipulating things or some kind of Western interference or NATO, right? All these things that Putin, all these things that Putin likes to claim. This is a people choosing their own destiny. And that terrifies Putin, because if Ukrainians can choose freedom, maybe Russians can too. Ukraine has its own language, its own culture, its own history, its own identity. The only reason anyone questions Ukraine's sovereignty is because of this Russian imperial mythology. The same mythology, by the way, that says Poland is not real, the Baltics are not real, that any former Soviet republic is naturally Russian. This mythology is Neptune's delusion. And Saturn is here to shatter it in the end, not today, but the tension has arrived, right? They are together and they are like, oh, what is it going to be? Who's going to win this thing? And they're moving backwards, meaning rethink, redo, re-examine. So Saturn is here with this reality, and the Ukrainians would rather die today than submit. The reality is that Ukrainians would rather die than allow this thing to occur. The reality is that you've got a Jewish president defending apartment buildings from this nightly bombardment, not a Nazi, which is another thing that the Russians like to say about him and the people around him. He's a comedian turned president, standing up to this KGB thug like David and Goliath, right? Why? Why is it so powerful? Why is it so intense? Why are Ukrainians so sure that they have to carry out this fight, that they cannot surrender? Well, here's your trigger warning. If you want to jump 60 or 90 seconds just to be safe. Those of you who stay, I just need you to understand that it is not just the apartment buildings that are being bombarded. In every single Ukrainian town that the Russian military occupies, we see a pattern with the same tools, the same rooms, the same language, the same questions, the same process of picking who comes in. These people systematically torture and incarcerate and sexually assault the townspeople. Not just the adults, not just the men. The people who live there are systematically brutalized in search of information and domination. The children are torn from their parents and sent into Russia and housed in databases waiting to be adopted, while they languish in re-education camps where they are beat if they don't recite the propaganda. People have Russian symbols carved into their skin. Their teeth are knocked out. Their genitals are hitched to car batteries. Their bones are broken. Their eyes are forced out of their skull. I'm done. I'm sorry. I'm done. If you're coming back in, but that's what it's like. It's not a Geneva Convention war. It's not a normal war. It's a war in search of psychological destruction through terror, through systematic terror and mortal wounds of a people. The land, sure, but the people must be squished and erased. I just needed you to understand the gravity of what our president did when he and his soldiers kneeled to this person last week. It's so much. It's so awful. And once again, I brought you to the brink, and I want to say, anyway, there's hope. There's hope anyway. So what is the hope, Kate? What in the world is the hope? Well, first we have to understand that what we're watching is the death of an empire as an organizing principle, right? So not just Russia, but empires all over the world. The idea that one nation has the right to consume another, that might makes right, that sovereignty is negotiable. These are delusions that are being confronted by this intersection of Neptune, Mr. Dream, and delusion, and Saturn, Mr. Reality, when they, not today, when they enter Aries. So dreams shift dramatically when Neptune enters Aries. Borders shift dramatically when Saturn and Neptune are together in Aries. They've been playing, but they aren't together yet. The people rise up when Uranus and Pluto are contributing, and they're contributing now. I mean, could the Saturn-Neptune border shift be, for the first time, one that expands the boundaries of Russia? I guess so. Doesn't seem likely, but I mean, when you want to know what's going to happen, when you're trying to predict the future, of course, the prediction is dumb, right? It's still, you can't really know what's going to happen. But what you can do is you can guess, you can have hypotheses like any other, empirical question. You can have hypotheses. Those hypotheses are based on patterns. So if, for example, you're about to have a very significant transit where some big guy is moving over some big thing in your chart, and we're looking at it and we're trying to figure out how that's going to go down for you, the easiest way to know is to look at what happened the last time that guy did that, and the time before that, and the time before that. So I can give you 3 dates, and you can tell me what happened on those dates, and we can start to draw conclusions about what this might look like as it unfolds. One thing we know for certain, though, about what's going to unfold is that the humans involved, which does include us, by the way, have a significant say in what happens. The variables are in play. Like, we're set up for success here if we rise, if we move, if we react. But this is about much more than Ukraine. It's about much more than any other significant conflict on the planet that mimics these horrors, that resonates with these same horrors. Every single one of us has something sovereign within us, something that cannot be conquered, cannot be colonized, cannot be made to submit. I imagine that you have something in your life that is asking this question of, like, are you sovereign in this situation? Are you are you in dominion over yourself, right? Are you in charge of yourself, of your own life or not, of this part of your life or not, right? The same cosmic forces asking Ukraine to fight for its existence are asking each of us, what is sacred to you about you? What will you not surrender? Where is your line? What will you do, to misquote Mary Oliver, with your one wild, precious, sovereign life? The Great Pyramid, the Great Flying Wedge of Chaos, is creating flowing energy between transformation, revolution, reality, delusion. Got Mars now, war, pushing it forward, right? We can use this energy to build new structures based on dignity rather than dominance, on sovereignty rather than submission. But we have to choose. We have to be conscious. We have to be proactive. We have to refuse the comfortable delusions and face the harsh realities. You really want these two fools standing on their own red carpet with their planes and their vapid ideas of dominion to be deciding this shit? To be deciding the future of the planet? Right? We have to imagine something different. We have to take hold of our own power in order to imagine and produce something different. Okay, so Tim Snyder is somebody that you should know. He is a scholar of the history of this part of the world. But anyway, Snyder this morning wrote the following: Americans tend to think that we know everything. This is never the case, and such a belief is especially harmful when we are outsiders to a horrendous war. Both Ukrainians and Russians know things that we either do not know or tend to forget. The Russians work to put our own knowledge gaps to good use. I would add that the Russians use our culture wars to profound effect, too, right? Give me an American who's curious about the Kremlin talking points. I'll give you an American who is alarmed by the mechanics of a trans life, of trans identity, right? Putin knows that. He knows we're at each other's throats about how we identify, about how we live. And we've got to notice how he leverages this aspect of our country's moment. He is leveraging it with the skill and savvy of a trained, practiced, professional intelligence officer. Snyder also said this morning, on the other side, on the Ukrainian side, people are fighting a war of necessity. They're fighting for their lives and for a way of life. We use such language so often ourselves that we trivialize it or make it cinematic, and so we may not recognize an actual existential situation when it is before our eyes. There is no oligarchical whimsy at play here, unlike in the Kremlin. Unlike Putin, Ukraine's President Zelensky is not fighting a war of choice. He was elected in a free election, in a free country that was minding its own business. And he is now doing what his people expect him to do because they have been attacked and are attacked daily. Because Ukrainians have been attacked by Russia and then subjected to Russian murder campaigns, mass torture, and the kidnapping of their children, they cannot simply stop fighting because they are asked to or told to. This is all the more true since Russia has violated every single pertinent agreement it has ever made with Ukraine. End quote. And if you don't understand that last point, I'll just say very briefly that there are these two moments in Minsk in 2014 and 2015 where the United States, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine sign agreements that ask Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons. So after the Cold War, there were all these nuclear weapons all over the former Soviet Union, and Ukraine had a bunch of them. So imagine today if they still had them, how this would be going down. It would look much more like India and Pakistan, who have nuclear weapons and who look across this border that they fight over, Kashmir, and they're like, I mean, I'll punch you in the eye a couple times a year, right? I'll start something. I don't like you. I'll make sure you know that. I'm going to make sure the people that live in this region suffer on your side, right? Like there's that, but there's no war because they both have nuclear weapons. And if your neighbor has a nuclear weapon, even if you don't like them, even if you think that there's a problem with where the border is drawn, you don't throw fists. You just don't. And that's what could be happening now in Ukraine if Ukraine had kept its nuclear weapons. But Ukraine allowed its nuclear weapons to be destroyed. Why would it have done that? Well, in these agreements signed in Minsk, the United States said, under Obama, by the way, the United States said, hey, if you do this, we will protect you. We'll protect you. We'll be there. We'll be there when you need us. You don't have to worry. We have some. You can give yours up. Russia said, I know we've been screwing around in parts of your country lately, but we're not going to do anything else. Honestly, Putin signed this agreement and Obama. And Putin was like, yeah, no, if you give up those weapons, we will not bother you anymore. And so Ukraine did. How did that work out? Right? Putin cannot keep promises. He signs agreements, much like the United States government in relationship with Native American nations in this country. Sure, yeah, no, we can have this agreement now so that we get what we want out of it. And we promise other things for later. Well, other things for later don't happen. There's this other guy, Mark Galeotti. He's this lovely, nerdy British dude who has this podcast called In Moscow's Shadow. He writes that Putin has lately come more and more to believe in his own mythology. And as he seeks to imagine himself as this man who made Russia great again, Galeotti points out that Putin is so confident of victory in Ukraine that he believed Ukrainians would cheer Russian troops as liberators, right? So he's that much in his own world, in his own bubble. We see this with Trump too, where like they don't have any real truth anymore because they've corrupted the enough of the media that they're getting their stories back on the TV. They've got people around them who are afraid to let them down because what happens when you let this guy down is no good, right? So they've got yes men around them, and then they're spewing their own mythology that gets consumed by the yes men, that gets consumed by the media that's facing this bubble, and the whole thing just feeds on itself, right? And so that is what's happening with Russia as well. Gallaudet is right. He really thought that they would drive in and the Ukrainian people would be so grumpy with their president that they would welcome him. Gallaudet calls this the opulent isolation of an information bubble, right? Because he's so fancy, Putin, right? So this is what happens when Neptune delusions become policy, when leaders mistake their fantasies for reality. Let me share a quick statement from this Ukrainian poet named Serhiy Zadam, who writes from Kharkiv as it's being bombed one night. He says, "We're defending not just our land, but the very possibility of being who we choose to be, speaking the language we choose to speak, remembering the history we choose to remember, loving whom we choose to love. This is not about East or West, Russia or Europe. This is about the right to exist without permission, to be sovereign in our own souls." That's what's at stake. Not just Ukrainian sovereignty, but the very principle that people have the right to determine their own fate. So where does that leave us? What do those of us still living in a relatively free society have to do with our worry or our fear or our anger? We can learn, we can grow, we can think, we can participate in discourse, we can reflect, we can move, we can rise, we can speak, we can act. So let's start with an action. I like to leave you with 3 things to do. 3 things to ponder. The action here is learn the real history of Ukraine. Read Timothy Snyder's books, read Bloodlands, read On Tyranny, or watch his Yale introductory course on YouTube, which is, he put it up for free. It's amazing. Or watch Winter on Fire, which is a brilliant documentary about Maidan. Understand that Ukraine is not a part of Russia any more than Ireland is a part of the UK, or Mexico is a part of the United States, or reverse that, any more than Texas is a part of Mexico. It used to be, it's not now, right? These are sovereign borders. And until very, very, very recently, we were living in a world where that mattered. Challenge the imperial mythology wherever you encounter it, even in your own mind. And if you can, support organizations that are directly sending aid to the Ukrainians. There's this lovely podcast coming out of the Telegraph. It's a British, conservative British newspaper. It's called Ukraine the Latest. And every day they crank out these episodes that give you an update about what's happening on the ground, but also what's happening with the diplomacy. And also what's happening with the humans, like how is it going? How are they surviving? What's happening? Who is caring for them? Who is supporting them? How are they taking care of themselves? How are they enduring this, right? And within that podcast, they have a lovely like resource on their website if you want to look at, how you can help. I would send things directly to people. I would not try to use large agencies and certainly not governments. Next, I want to give you a practice. Every day this week, find some time to ask yourself, where in my life am I accepting someone else's definition of my reality? Where am I accepting or tolerating someone else's energy in my shit? Where am I tolerating someone else's dominion over my own sacred sovereignty? Neptune's fog is affecting all of us. Where have you been told that you're not sovereign, not real, not legitimate? Where have you been told that your feelings aren't right or righteous? That's not a thing. Where have you believed it? This is the shadow work. This is also freedom work. I want to bring you back to energy hygiene on this, right? So like the very act of taking back your own energy field after every interaction, or, once a day, to clear out all of yesterday's interactions, all of yesterday's meetings, all of yesterday's encounters with some unpleasant person on the street, all of yesterday's embraces with loved ones. How can you assert your own sovereignty through your day, throughout your week, Me, I do it every morning in a pretty elaborate way. I'm a very porous person. Like we use that word empath. If you've lived through any kind of significant trauma, you are built to track and absorb and respond to and evaluate everything that's going on with everybody all around you at all times. That's just how trauma works. We can call it empathic if we want to, but really it's vigilance. It's like we are constantly evaluating what is happening with all the people at all the times. And so in living that way, you are spongy and, you're powerful, but you're spongy. And, you gotta treat it with respect, right? So every single morning, I do this practice with, like, this space right here around me belongs to me, regardless of who I have invited in, regardless of who has intruded or invited themselves in, regardless of the relationships in my life, regardless of how many roommates or children I have, regardless of how many people I share a workspace with. This right here is mine, this little egg around me, and you can even visualize the kind of strings of it coming, like, up out of your head and into, like, the bottom of the egg, which is far below you, and from your feet into the top of your head, like, above your head that's far above you, right? So there's just this big egg that kind of circles all around you. This right here is mine, and if I create space and time to actually take it all back each day as if it is my birthright, my day goes differently. I promise you. And finally, some inspiration from the Mary Oliver poem I butchered earlier, which reminds each of us in this pivotal hour to know what we want to do with this precious life of ours. And for those of us still living in relative freedom, this means knowing what our values are, what is worth fighting for, what it is that we believe is real. This is her classic and often quoted poem. It's called A Summer Day. She starts it by saying, "Who made the world?" Eventually, she ends it with this. She says, "I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I've been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Y'all, we are living through a war, not just Ukraine's war, a war for the very concept of sovereignty, of dignity, of truth in this world and on this planet. It is going to take peace and consciousness and information and kindness to each other and to other beings to know in our bodies what to do about the fact that empire today continues to ravenously devour democracy. What will you and I and the other people on the planet do now between this time and that time? Between now and the rest of our lives to stop this? What will we do between now and February? What will we do between now and 2028 to stop this? The cosmos is asking us to wake up. Saturn is stripping away Neptune's comfortable delusions. Mars has lit the fuse on this, demanding that we face the fight, whether we understand it or not. This flying wedge of chaos is offering us actually unprecedented support for transformation. But we would have to choose consciousness over comfort, truth over mythology, sovereignty over empire, and I would even say community over tribe. We have spent a lot of time building our brick houses on the opposite sides here, right? We have well-earned, urgently held beliefs, experiences, opinions, fights that are opposing in this country. What if, though, now, as horrible thing after horrible thing after horrible thing happens, just like in Maidan, we allow the occasional coming together? I think the Epstein thing is a perfect example of that, right? We were all like, right, the Epstein files. And then this thing exploded and we were like, oh, wait, the Epstein files. Right? So there's a bunch of these things that like if we in the right circumstances with the right light and the right person delivering it to you, you might take it quite differently than you do. Right? So it is time to listen to each other. It is time to say, I have an opinion. I have a set of experiences. I have a set of evidence. I have a set of stories. I have a set of facts. And a set of values, and yours are different than mine. That doesn't mean I have to hate you anymore. It actually now means I have to find a way to hear you. right? We have to find a way to be in discourse with each other. Just pick one thing, pull it off. Just pick one thing and find a way where we can tolerate the values of each other. So very few of us are sociopathic, like truly sociopathic, right? So very few of us are actual animals. I know an animal or two, so do you, for sure. But that's not mainly what's going on here, right? There's a mass delusion going on here. There's a lot of confusion. So we kind of owe it to ourselves and to our families and to people who used to be friends or used to be colleagues, or people we meet online, people who start out nasty and maybe don't need to stay nasty, right? These conversations can de-escalate. The energy is rising, but maybe part of the energy rising means we are forced to look at each other, are forced to talk to each other, are forced to find common ground, or to simply say, your values are different than mine, and I'm okay with that. You're still human, and you still love your family. You still love your home. You still love your dog. You still love your country, right? Your freedom does not have to conflict with mine. That's why we fight. We fight because we think our freedoms are in conflict. They don't have to be. We can pick it out. We can work it out. If we are less worried about which side we're on and what you have, like if I can like put down my list of grievances about the other side and just listen and just try to communicate and try to find common ground, maybe as horrible thing after horrible thing happens, you and I can agree on a set of horrible things that shouldn't have happened. That's a place to start. The Ukrainian people have chosen. They have shown us what it looks like to say no to this greater horrible, even when it costs everything, over and over and over again. The question now is, what will we choose? And by we, I mean the collective. I mean all of us. I mean humanity. What will we choose as this thing starts to vibrate and rattle all over the planet, as it did in 2013, when Maidan occurred, right? As it did in 1989, when the people rose up and the Berlin Wall fell, right? It is happening. It is happening to us now. If you would like to understand how these patterns are affecting you personally, how your own sovereignty is being activated by these transits, it would be my great honor to look into it with you. I offer readings and coaching that help you navigate your unique relationship with these energies, your unique assignment during this threshold moment. My email is in the episode description. If you could also please review. Oh my God, some people have been writing reviews. They're so beautiful. They're so loving. They're so helpful. They're so inspiring and encouraging. And every time you do that, it will grow the podcast. It will grow the community. It will grow the conversation. So also find me on the damn socials. I am not built for social media. I am not built for social media. But I'm putting little clips of these things out, and it would be helpful if you go find it and follow it and like it and talk about it. There are some folks that are starting to respond to the videos with like talking about the details of their own charts vis-a-vis the topic that I'm raising that day, like the planet or the issue. And it's lovely. Like we could all just have that conversation together about how these things are affecting us. But until next time, remember that sovereignty, personal and national, is not negotiable. Empire's time is ending. The question is coming to the table. The only thing remaining is whether we will consciously participate in building what comes next, or whether we'll avoid and not look at and not confront. And we'll sleep through this revolution, right? It'll be smaller and less decisive than it might have been. There's also a scenario where we don't do anything and this thing just locks. Something will shift and will hold after this. Saturn makes things real. Something's got to give between now and then, and we know how we want it to give. Let's feed that new dream together, collectively. Until next time, be well, be conscious, and be kind. I will see you soon.